Have you ever wondered what the Last Supper actually tasted like? What did the common people of Galilee eat while listening to Jesus of Nazareth, or what ingredients were considered a luxury 2,000 years ago? In this documentary, we set aside Renaissance paintings to discover the true biblical diet. From barley bread to the flavors of the Sea of Galilee, we explore the gastronomy of Jesus' time to understand how climate, religion, and Roman culture shaped first-century cuisine. Join us on this culinary journey into the past. Have you ever wondered why, in almost every ancient story, bread seems to be much more than just food? It is no coincidence that the most famous prayers in history ask for daily bread and not daily steak. 2,000 years ago, in first-century Judea and Galilee, bread was not a side dish for dinner. Bread was dinner. If the bread failed, society collapsed. In this section, we are going to dive into the heart of the biblical diet to understand how something as simple as a grain of cereal defined who you were, how much money you had, and how you survived in a world without supermarkets or refrigeration. To understand the importance of bread in the time of Jesus, we must first look at the ground. Agriculture was the backbone of the economy, but it was no easy task. The Galilean farmer depended entirely on the early and late rains. A year of drought literally meant famine for an entire village. The two protagonist cereals were wheat and barley, but they did not hold the same status. If you walked through the hills of Judea 2,000 years ago and saw someone eating fine white wheat bread, you were looking at a member of the elite, perhaps a Roman administrator or a member of the temple aristocracy. Wheat was difficult to grow, requiring better soil and more water, making it a luxury item. On the contrary, barley was the grain of the people. It was hardier, grew in poorer soils, and was therefore much cheaper. In fact, when we read the biblical accounts of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, the text specifies they were barley loaves. This gives us a powerful historical fact. Jesus was not feeding wealthy people. He was in the midst of the working class, the people who ate the most basic things the earth could offer. But how did one go from a field of grain to a warm loaf? This is where the hard work truly began. Imagine not being able to go to the store to buy flour. The process started with harvesting by hand using iron sickles or wood with flint inserts. Once the grain was cut, it was taken to the threshing floor, a flat, circular rock surface. Here, animals were used to trample the ears of grain, or wooden sleds with sharp stones on the bottom were used to separate the grain from the straw. Then came the winnowing, which involved throwing the mixture into the air with a wooden fork so the wind would carry away the lighter straw while the grain fell to the ground. This process was so vital that it became a recurring metaphor in the speeches of the time to talk about judgment and purification. The clean grain was stored in large clay jars to protect it from rodents and moisture, the silent enemies of ancient survival. Every morning before sunrise, the sound that dominated the villages of Nazareth or Capernaum was not traffic, but the rhythmic scraping of millstones. Grinding grain was a grueling daily task that fell almost exclusively to women. They used two basalt stones, a fixed base and a smaller upper stone moved by hand. To obtain enough flour for a small family, a woman could spend up to 3 hours grinding. The resulting flour was not the white, ultra-processed powder we know today. It was whole grain flour, coarse, full of fiber, and often containing small stone particles shed from the mill, which over time wore down the teeth of the inhabitants, a detail archaeologists confirm when analyzing skeletal remains. Once you had the flour, it was time for chemical magic, fermentation. Back then, packets of industrial yeast did not exist. Sourdough was used. Each family kept a piece of dough from the previous day that already contained natural yeasts and environmental bacteria. By mixing this piece with new flour and water, the entire mass began to rise. This process was so fundamental that the concept of leaven was constantly used as an example of how something small can transform something large, for better or worse. Unleavened bread, or matzah, was only consumed in times of extreme haste or during Passover, as a reminder of the exodus from Egypt when there was no time to wait for the dough to rise. The climax of this process was the baking. In humble homes, the tabboun was used, a truncated cone-shaped clay oven heated by burning dried animal dung or small branches. Bread was not baked in molds. It was spread into flat, thin discs, similar to what we know today as pita or laffa bread. These discs were slapped directly onto the hot interior walls of the oven. In a few minutes, the intense heat puffed the bread and cooked it. The result was a flexible bread, perfect for use not only as food but as a utensil. In a culture where there were no steel forks or spoons, the bread was your spoon. You broke it with your hands, it was never cut with a knife out of respect for its sacred character, and used it to scoop up lentil stew, soak up olive oil, or wrap a piece of roasted fish. Bread was the center of hospitality, a non-negotiable value in the Near East. Denying bread to a traveler was an unimaginable social disgrace. When Jesus describes himself as the bread of life, he is not using an abstract poetic image, he is using the most powerful image of survival his listeners knew. Without bread, the body dies. In their context, bread was the difference between life and death. Furthermore, the consumption of bread united the community. Eating from the same loaf established a covenant of peace between people at the table. That is why Jesus eating bread with tax collectors and sinners was so scandalous to the religious elite. He was establishing a bond of brotherhood with the marginalized through the most sacred food. If we could travel back in time and taste a piece of that barley bread fresh from the tabun, we would be surprised by its intense, earthy flavor. It wasn't sweet, it was dense and satiating. It was often enriched with cumin, sesame seeds, or Dead Sea salt for flavor. In times of scarcity, grain flour was even mixed with bean or lentil flour to stretch it out, a survival technique that shows the creativity of the women of the time in keeping their families fed. Bread was, ultimately, the clock that marked the rhythm of life. From the autumn sowing to the spring harvest, and from the dawn grinding to dinner at sunset, a person's entire existence in the first century revolved around this cycle of grain, water, and fire. To understand the bread of 2,000 years ago is to understand the struggle, faith, and resilience of a culture that, with the bare minimum, managed to build the foundations of Western history. Bread was not just food, it was the very fabric of reality. Can you imagine spending 3 hours every morning just to prepare the flour for your breakfast? That gives us a new perspective on what it meant to earn your bread by the sweat of your brow. But bread was not alone on the table. To help it go down, something was needed that was as common as water back then, but much safer to drink. In the next section, we are going to discover how fishing in the Sea of Galilee was not just a trade for a few, but a massive industry that fed an entire region, and how fish became the inseparable companion of bread in Jesus' diet. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way, you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's move on. Have you ever wondered why the oldest symbol of Christianity was not a cross, but a fish? The answer is not just theological, but deeply gastronomic and economic. While in modern cities we see fish as a healthy supermarket option, 2,000 years ago in the Galilee region, fish was the engine that moved the world. It was the protein of the people, the gold of the nets, and the base of an industry that fed everyone from the humblest peasant to the most demanding palates of the Roman Empire. In this section, we are going to dive into the waters of the Sea of Galilee to understand how they fished, how they preserved it, and why fish was the inseparable companion of bread at the table of Jesus and his contemporaries. To begin, we must place ourselves geographically. The Sea of Galilee, which is actually a freshwater lake, was the epicenter of life in northern Judea. It was not the idyllic place of rest we imagine today, but a beehive of industrial activity. Its shores were crowded with ports, shipyards, and salting factories. The most common species that ended up in the nets were mainly three: tilapias, barbel, and freshwater sardines. The tilapia, known globally today as St. Peter's fish, was the favorite. It is a fish with plenty of meat and few small bones, making it ideal for grilling. But catching these specimens was not a task for amateurs. Fishermen like Peter, Andrew, James, and John were not solitary men with a fishing pole sitting on a pier. They were entrepreneurs in a harsh and dangerous industry who worked mainly at night. Why fish at night? This is one of the keys to this documentary. In the clear waters of the lake, the fish could see the nets during the day and avoid them. Additionally, the cool of the night helped prevent the catch from rotting before reaching the shore under the scorching sun of the Near East. The fishermen used three types of nets: the cast net, adaria, thrown by hand from the shore or a boat; the trammel net, a complex three-layered net that trapped fish by the gills; and the large dragnet, which required several boats and dozens of men to be pulled toward the beach. It was grueling physical work, full of calluses and backs burned by effort, but it was incredibly lucrative. In fact, archaeology has revealed that the fishermen's houses in Capernaum were notably more spacious than those of farmers inland, telling us that fish was the big business of the area. But here comes a fascinating logistical problem. How do you get fish from a lake in the north to the markets of Jerusalem or even to Rome without it rotting on the way? The answer lies in a city that often goes unnoticed in biblical accounts: Magdala. The name of this city means Tower of Fish or Place of Processing. There, an industrial network of stone tanks was located where the fish was cleaned and subjected to an intensive salting process. Dried and salted fish was the equivalent of our modern canned goods. It could last for months and be transported on the backs of donkeys along all trade routes. They also manufactured the famous garum, a fermented fish sauce that was a Roman obsession. Imagine an extremely salty, pungent sauce with a very powerful umami flavor, made from fish innards left in the sun for weeks. For a Roman, garum was like today's ketchup or soy sauce. It was poured on everything, and the Galilean factories exported this delicacy all over the Mediterranean. If you sat down to eat with a common family in the time of Jesus, chances are the fish wouldn't be a fresh, juicy fillet like the one you order in a restaurant. Most common was consuming small salted sardines that served as a condiment for bread. It was a convenience food, fast, cheap, and full of sodium to recover salts lost through sweat in the fields. However, on special occasions, fish was roasted whole over glowing coals, seasoned with sea salt and perhaps a drizzle of olive oil and vinegar. This aroma of roasted fish was the daily perfume of the coastal villages. Now, many wonder, what about red meat? This is where the diet of 2,000 years ago differs drastically from ours. For an average inhabitant of Judea, eating beef or lamb was an extraordinary event. A cow or an ox was a work animal, the engine of the plow. Killing an ox to eat, it was like scrapping a brand new tractor to have a barbecue. It simply made no economic sense. Lamb and goat were reserved for major religious festivals, like Passover, or for wedding banquets and high-level celebrations. Meat was a status symbol. If we read the parable of the prodigal son, the climax of the party is when the father orders the killing of the fatted calf. That detail told the audience that the joy was immense because they were sacrificing a massive economic investment just for the pleasure of celebrating. A crucial aspect we cannot forget when talking about food in this era is the laws of ritual purity, or Kashrut. For a first-century Jew, the table was an altar, and what you placed on it defined your holiness. This marked an invisible but insurmountable border between them and their Roman and Greek neighbors. Pork was strictly forbidden. While Romans raised pigs on a massive scale as an efficient source of fat and meat, in the Jewish villages of Galilee, you wouldn't find a single one. This was so distinctive that historians of the time joked it was easier to be a Jew's pig than his son, because at least the pig wouldn't be killed. Besides pork, shellfish, squid, and any fish without scales and fins were prohibited. This means that foods we consider Mediterranean basics today, like shrimp or mussels, were off the menu by divine order. This dietary discipline created a very strong cultural identity. When Jesus sat down to eat, he was respecting a code that separated him from pagan influence. However, his message often challenged the rigid interpretation of these rules, reminding people that it is not what enters the mouth that defile a man, but what comes out of the heart. Still, the diet remained strictly local. Protein was supplemented with chicken and quail eggs, and occasionally with grasshoppers or locusts, which were the only insects considered pure and were consumed fried or dried with honey, especially by people living in the desert, like John the Baptist. Life in the first century was a constant struggle for nutritional balance. Fish provided the phosphorus and proteins necessary for the brain and muscles, while legumes like lentils and chickpeas, which we will discuss later, completed the base of the food pyramid. Looking at the fishermen's nets in the Sea of Galilee, we are not just seeing an ancient trade, we are seeing the logistics that allowed a message to spread throughout an entire region. Fishermen were men of the world, accustomed to dealing with merchants of different languages and cultures in the ports. They were the perfect bridge. Imagine for a moment the Jerusalem market during a great feast. The smell of dried fish from Magdala mixing with the smoke of sacrifices in the temple and the aroma of fresh-baked bread. That mixture of smells was the essence of life 2,000 years ago. Fish was literally the fuel for the spiritual and social revolution happening in Judea. But bread and fish needed something more to avoid becoming monotonous. They needed the colors and nutrients of the land. In the next section, we are going to leave the coast to enter the orchards and olive groves, where we will discover the 7 sacred fruits that gave flavor, health, and, above all, a surprising longevity to the inhabitants of the Promised Land. Prepare to discover why olive oil was not just for eating and which fruit was so valuable it was used as currency. Have you ever wondered why in ancient scriptures the land of Israel is described as a place flowing with milk and honey, when what we see today are mostly arid and rocky landscapes? The answer is not in a poetic metaphor, but in a list of 7 sacred ingredients that were so vital they were considered a direct divine blessing. If bread was the body of the diet and fish was the strength, the fruits of the land were the soul, the medicine, and the pleasure of daily life 2,000 years ago. In this section, we are going to enter the orchards of Galilee and the olive groves of Judea to discover how these foods not only kept Jesus' contemporaries healthy, but created an explosion of flavors that today would be the envy of any high-end Mediterranean restaurant. To understand the plant-based diet of the time, we must first talk about the undisputed king of the kitchen, olive oil. If oil moves the world today, 2,000 years ago olive oil moved civilization. But don't think of it only as something you put on a salad. Olive oil was the fuel for the lamps that lit homes at night, the base for soaps and perfumes, medicine for wounds, and, of course, the main fat for cooking. Butter as we know it today did not exist in that area, and animal fat was expensive and hard to preserve. The olive tree was a sacred tree because it was almost immortal. Some of the trees Jesus saw in the Garden of Gethsemane might be the very same ones still showing their twisted trunks in Jerusalem today. Olives were harvested by hand and taken to massive stone presses where a huge beam crushed the fruits to extract the liquid gold. The first pressing, the purest, was reserved for the temple and the tables of the wealthy, while subsequent pressings were the daily food of the common people, who dipped their barley bread in bowls filled with oil flavored with wild herbs. But the landscape was not just full of olive trees. If you walked through the valleys in summer, the air was heavy with the sweet smell of fig trees. The fig was the candy of antiquity. In a world where refined sugar did not exist and chocolate was from a continent yet to be discovered, the fig provided the quick energy a worker needed. They were eaten fresh directly from the tree, but most were dried in the sun and pressed into blocks called fig cakes. These blocks were the energy bars of the first century. Travelers and shepherds carried them in their bags because they didn't rot, were easy to transport, and gave incredible strength for walking through the hills. When Jesus looked for figs on a fig tree, it wasn't just a whim. It was because, in that culture, a fruit tree without fruit was seen as a tragedy, a broken promise of life. Alongside figs, we must speak of pomegranates and dates. The pomegranate, with its hundreds of jewel-like red seeds, was a symbol of fertility and abundance. Its sweet and sour juice was one of the most refreshing drinks and was often used to give color and acidity to meat stews at festivals. On the other hand, dates were the jewel of the oases. The date palms of Jericho were famous throughout the Roman Empire. The date was so versatile that date honey, or Ceylon, was extracted from it. When the Bible speaks of a land flowing with milk and honey, most historians agree it refers not to be honey, but to this thick, dark date syrup used to sweeten breads, cakes, and wines. It was a source of iron and potassium that kept the population with physical endurance that would seem superhuman to us today. However, not everything was sweet. The nutritional base that allowed people to work from sunup to sundown was legumes. If bread was the sustenance, lentils and chickpeas were the bricks of the body. There was no house in which a lentil pottage was not cooked almost daily. These were slow-cooked in clay pots along with onions, garlic, and leeks. It is important to note that many of the vegetables we consider essential in Mediterranean food today, like tomatoes, peppers, or potatoes, did not exist in the time of Jesus, as they are native to the Americas. Therefore, the flavor of biblical cuisine was much more herbaceous and earthy. Imagine a thick stew of red lentils, seasoned with cilantro, cumin, and a healthy dose of garlic. That was the smell of a real kitchen in Nazareth. Chickpeas were also fundamental, often roasted as a snack or mashed into dishes that were the direct ancestors of the hummus we know today. One element we often forget is wild herbs and spices. Jesus' food was not bland. The countryside was full of fennel, mint, dill, black mustard, and rue. These plants didn't just provide flavor. They served to preserve food and aid in the digestion of diets that were very heavy in fiber and whole grains. Salt was the treasure of the Dead Sea. It wasn't fine table salt, but coarse crystals full of minerals used for everything from preserving fish to paying wages. In fact, salt was so important that Jesus used it to describe the influence his followers should have on the world, something that preserves from corruption and gives flavor to life. Let's talk about the grape. Although we will dedicate an entire section to wine due to its complexity, the grape as a fruit was essential. It was consumed fresh during the harvest, but the vast majority were turned into raisins. Like figs, raisins were a way to store sugar for the winter. But most interesting was the use of agraz, the juice of unripe green grapes, which was used as a primitive vinegar to give an electric and vibrant touch to the cucumber and onion salads consumed to cool the body on days of extreme heat. The diet of the 7 fruits created enviable cardiovascular health. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains of the time have noted that while infant mortality was high and infectious diseases were dangerous, those who made it to adulthood usually had clean arteries and strong bones, thanks to this massive consumption of fiber, unsaturated fats from olive oil, and antioxidants from dark fruits like grapes and pomegranates. It wasn't a diet designed to lose weight, but to endure physical labor and the relentless climate. Eating in the time of Jesus was an act of connection with the earth. There were no intermediaries, no nutritional labels. You knew exactly who had grown your lentils because it was probably your neighbor or yourself. This respect for the product translated into a zero-waste kitchen. Nothing was wasted. Pomegranate peels were used to dye fabrics, olive pits were burned to heat ovens, and grape leaves were used to wrap small pieces of meat or wild rice. It was a perfect circular economy born of necessity and gratitude. Visualize for a moment a low table in a stone house in Capernaum at sunset. There are no individual plates. There is a large central ceramic platter with a steaming legume stew. Around it, baskets with dried figs, bowls with bitter olives cured in salt, and jars of fresh water. The smell is a mixture of wet earth, virgin olive oil, and the citrus aroma of field herbs. That was the nutritional reality that shaped the thoughts and words that changed the course of history. Every bite of a pomegranate or every chewed fig was a reminder that, despite Roman oppression or the hardships of life, the earth remained generous. But all this solid food needed a companion, something that wouldn't just quench thirst, but cheer the heart and form part of the nation's most sacred rituals. Did you know that water in ancient cities was often dangerous to drink, and that is why wine was a matter of public health? In the next section, we are going to discover the secrets of ancient cellars, how water was turned into wine at weddings, and why the most famous drink in history was very different from what you find in a glass bottle today. Prepare to enter the world of vineyards and discover why wine was considered the blood of the earth. Have you ever wondered why at the wedding at Cana the biggest drama wasn't running out of food, but running out of wine? For us, wine is an option on a drink menu, but 2,000 years ago in Jesus' Judea, wine was a matter of survival, health, and social honor. In a world where well water could be contaminated and cause deadly diseases in a matter of days, wine was not a luxury for getting drunk, but the purifier of daily life. In this section, we are going to enter ancient stone cellars to discover how the most important drink in history was made, why no one drank it pure, and what the true flavor of the cup Jesus shared with his disciples was. To understand first-century wine, we must first forget everything we know about glass bottles with corks and elegant labels. The wine of the era was a living, rustic, and extremely strong product. It all began in the vineyards that covered the hills of Judea. Grapes were the most valuable crop after olives. The harvest process was the most joyful time of the year. Entire families went up to the vineyards to pick clusters under the late summer sun. From there, grapes were taken to the winepress, which was not a machine, but a surface excavated directly into the limestone rock. The extraction method was the oldest and most effective in the world: treading. Groups of men and youths trod the grapes barefoot while singing and keeping the rhythm of stringed instruments. This method, although it might seem unhygienic to us today, was perfect because the pressure of the human foot is strong enough to break the grape skin but not enough to break the seeds, which contain bitter oils that would have ruined the wine's flavor. The resulting must flowed through channels carved in the rock into decanting vats. In the warm climate of Israel, fermentation began almost immediately thanks to natural yeasts present on the fruit's skin. There were no laboratories or chemists controlling the process. It was a dance between the fruit's sugar and the ambient heat. Once the natural boil of fermentation subsided, the wine was stored in large clay jars called amphorae or, for transport, in goatskin wineskins. This is where the famous metaphor about not putting new wine into old wineskins comes in. A new wineskin is flexible and can expand with fermentation gases. An old, dry one cracks and explodes. The resulting wine was a dense liquid, with a much higher alcohol content than today's and a flavor that would seem very strange to us. Because of its strength and because preservation techniques were not perfect, wine of that era tended to oxidize quickly or become too sour. To combat this, Jesus' contemporaries were masters of mixing. Wine was almost never drunk pure. Doing so was considered a custom of barbarians or people with severe alcoholism. The norm was to mix 1 part wine with 2 or 3 parts water. This served a double function. It softened the flavor and, most importantly, the alcohol in the wine killed the bacteria in the water, making it safe for children and adults to consume. But creativity didn't stop there. To hide flavor defects or simply make it more delicious, they added honey, spices like pepper or cinnamon, or even pine resin, which helped seal the pores of the clay vessels and gave it a balsamic touch similar to the Retsina wine still drunk in Greece today. However, wine was not the only form of hydration. Water remained the most precious and difficult resource to obtain. In Jerusalem and the villages of Judea, life depended on cisterns. Since it only rained a few months a year, every house had a rock chamber excavated underground, plastered with lime to collect rainwater from the roofs. Drinking cistern water was the norm, but it was stagnant water that often tasted of stone and dust. That is why finding a source of living water, that is, water flowing from a natural spring, was seen as a miracle or a special blessing from God. When Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman at the well about living water, he is using the most refreshing and desired analogy for anyone living under the scorching desert sun. But what about people who couldn't afford quality wine? There was a drink called pasca. Pasca was basically wine that had turned into vinegar, diluted with lots of water and sometimes mixed with herbs. It was the standard drink of the Roman legions and the poorest workers. It was acidic, incredibly thirst-quenching, and extremely cheap. In fact, when the crucifixion accounts mention that Jesus was offered vinegar on a sponge, it wasn't necessarily an act of cruelty. The soldiers were offering him the only thing they themselves had to drink, their daily ration of pasca. Wine also played a central role in the social structure of meals. It wasn't drunk in isolation. Wine was the catalyst for conversation. At banquets, there was a figure called the master of the feast, or architroklinos, who was in charge of deciding the mixing ratio of wine and water and ensuring no one drank to excess or was left with an empty cup. Wine was joy, but it was also responsibility. In the Jewish religious context, wine was indispensable for the Passover Seder. Each participant had to drink 4 cups of wine during the dinner, symbolizing the 4 promises of redemption. It was in this context that wine acquired its deepest meaning at the Last Supper, transforming from a simple agricultural product into a spiritual symbol of sacrifice and covenant. Beyond wine and water, there were other drinks less mentioned but present. Milk was consumed, but rarely fresh due to the heat. Most common was transforming it into curdled milk or primitive yogurt, called laban, which was very refreshing and aided digestion. Grain beers were also brewed, influenced by the cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, although in the Judea and Galilee area, wine culture was so dominant that beer was considered a lower class or foreign drink. There were also fermented fruit juices, like pomegranate or apple cider, but nothing held the prestige of the fruit of the vine. The impact of wine on the economy was total. A good grape harvest could pay a whole year's taxes and secure a dowry for a daughter's marriage. That is why Jesus' parables are full of vine dressers, pruning, and vineyard owners. It was the language everyone understood, from the beggar to the high priest. Wine was the link between human labor and nature's generosity. Drinking wine was celebrating that, despite the difficulties of Roman occupation, the land continued to give its fruit. Imagine for a moment entering a tavern in the port of Caesarea or a humble house in the mountains of Judea. The smell that would greet you would be a pungent mixture of damp clay, fermented fruit, and a sweet touch of honey. Taking a sip of that ancient wine, you would feel a roughness on your tongue, a warmth in your throat, and a complex flavor that tells the story of limestone soil and the Near Eastern sun. It wasn't a perfect drink, but it was a drink with soul. Wine and water marked the line between life and death, between health and disease. But to enjoy these drinks, an appropriate environment was needed, furniture and etiquette that dictated who sat where and why. Food was not just what was on the plate or in the cup, but how it was shared. In the next section, we are going to unearth the archaeology of the kitchen. We are going to discover that Jesus and his disciples probably didn't sit in chairs around a high wooden table, but ate in a much more comfortable and surprising way that changed forever how we understand their gatherings. Prepare to discover what a first-century dining room was really like and how archaeology has debunked centuries of classical art. Have you ever wondered if everything you've seen in paintings of the Last Supper is, in fact, a historical lie? For centuries, great painters have shown us Jesus and his apostles sitting on wooden chairs around a long, high table with white tablecloths and glass cups, as if they were at a 15th-century European banquet. But modern archaeology has a much more fascinating and strange version to tell us. If you could travel back in time and enter the room where that supper was held, or any well-to-do house in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, you would find a scene that looks more like a modern lounge than a traditional dining room. In this section, we are going to unearth the true archaeology of the kitchen and banquet protocol to understand how they sat, how they served the food, and why the table layout could cause fights for power and status. To understand how people ate in Jesus' time, we must first talk about the architecture of the dining room. In elite houses and in rooms rented for major festivities, the center of social life was the triclinium. This word, of Greek origin and adopted by the Romans, defines an arrangement of 3 platforms or low sofas placed in a U-shape around a very low central table. Forget chairs. In the 1st century, eating while sitting was something only hurried laborers or the very poor did in their tiny one-room houses. For a formal dinner, the elegant thing was to recline. Diners lay on their left side, leaning their elbow on a cushion and leaving their right hand free to reach for food from the common dishes. This position was not just for comfort, it was a symbol of freedom. In the ancient world, slaves ate standing or sitting, while free men ate reclining. That is why, at the Passover meal, it was mandatory to recline to symbolize that they were no longer slaves in Egypt, but a free people. The most evident legacy is the use of olive oil. What was once lamp fuel is known today as one of the healthiest fats for the heart due to its monounsaturated fatty acids and polyphenol. Those people who dipped their bread in virgin oil were, without knowing it, protecting their arteries and reducing inflammation. Similarly, the massive consumption of legumes like lentils and chickpeas, which we have seen were daily staples, provided a quantity of fiber and plant protein that is scarce in today's Western diet loaded with processed foods. Archaeologists and nutritionists agree that the absence of refined sugars and the exclusive use of date honey or figs as sweeteners prevented the metabolic diseases that are an epidemic today. But the legacy of biblical food is not just nutritional, it is also rhythmic. 2,000 years ago, food was tied to the seasons. People didn't eat grapes in winter or oranges out of season. This respect for seasonality ensured that food had maximum nutrient density. Furthermore, the practice of fasting and moderation, integrated into the Jewish religious calendar, allowed the body periods of rest and natural detoxification. Today, concepts like intermittent fasting are gaining popularity, but for first-century people, this was simply a natural part of their life cycle and spirituality. Another fascinating aspect is the connection between food and community. We have learned that in Jesus' time, eating alone was almost unthinkable. The table was a place for dialogue, teaching, and conflict resolution. In our modern era of pre-cooked meals in front of a TV or phone screen, we have lost the social component of eating, which is vital for mental health and digestion. The act of breaking bread with others, as was done in the triclinium or in humble Galilean homes, generated bonds that strengthened the social fabric. The lesson here is clear. Food feeds the body, but company feeds the soul. As we close this first-century journey, we realize that those men and women didn't have much, but what they had was real. Their food had a face, a name, and came directly from the earth or the sea. There were no labels with unpronounceable ingredients, only wheat, oil, wine, fish, and fruit. By studying how they ate, we are not just doing culinary archaeology, we are rediscovering a slower, more conscious way of life, and curiously, one more connected to what our bodies truly need. This documentary has tried to take you beyond the textbook images so that you can smell the aroma of fresh-baked barley bread and taste the salty flavor of Judean olives. Next time you see a bottle of olive oil or a cluster of grapes, remember that you are looking at elements that have shaped human history and that, 2,000 years ago, were the protagonists of the most momentous moments in the lives of Jesus and his followers. History is not just read, it is also tasted. If you like this video, subscribe and like. Soon we will see new curiosities about daily life in this time. Also, let me know in the comments what other topics you would like to see.